My talk today will be about continuous API management from a technical writer's perspective. My name is Thanh. I'm a technical writer at Nets, a part of Nexi Group. I'm based in Copenhagen, born and raised in Denmark. I've been a technical writer for a bit over a year now. Just to very briefly go over Nets and Nexi and the kind of different sectors we're within, which will tie back into my topic for today. So we're doing businesses in different sectors such as bank and financial institutions, public sector, and retailers and merchants. And I'm in charge of maintaining the technical documentation for the product named Easy within e-commerce. And this is just a few examples of the products that we have. So what is Easy? Easy is a checkout solution for e-commerce where if you are a merchant and you're selling something on your web shop, you're able to have the checkout solution and you'll be able to input your important details, contact information, and then choose how you would like to pay and finalize the purchase. So tying that back into my role and continuing having this API management and how we're having our workflows, I'll go into how we have our Azure DevOps environment set up and the Polar pipeline and ways of working. So the technical writers in my team, we're having this pipeline called Polar. And this is pulling the latest version of the API from the endpoint, which is generated by Swashbuckle. And I'll quickly just show. So here it looks like this from the Swagger documentation. And by the endpoint, you see the URL up at the top. You'll see that this looks like this in a raw version. This is the raw JSON file that will be generated. And then that will be pushed into our data repository so the tech writers can look into, what has been updated from the developers and what do we want to have be user-facing for merchants when they're reading through the documentation. So the Polar pipeline looks like so, and it will be running maybe approximately every other hour, and then it's comparing the two versions to see, are there any changes? And the way the tech writers will get notified is we'll see that the developers have made some change, and then we'll go over the pull request to see what has been done. And this is just an example. We see that, in the raw JSON file, the response has been amended, and we'll go over it to see, would that make sense, and then have that merged. So here's an example of how the technical writers are looking into the two different versions of documents. On one hand is the raw JSON file that I just explained, and the other one is the doc JSON file. So in this way, we'll be able to compare and see, what were the changes, and would this be, should this be put onto our tech site? Yeah, so the tech writers will create a branch and then look over that, commit and push it, do a pull request, and then we merge that into the master. And then it will look like this on our public API documentation, and you're able to go into all the different folders and see each of them has a little introduction, and each of the methods and the parameters are outlined with the descriptions. So just to focus on these two JSON files and really the value of having a technical writer is that you would be a very important connector between a lot of the teams and making sure that you're getting inputs from many different sides. So both the developers, of course, product team, operations, but also support. In any ways, if there's needed to be any changes, if merchants aren't understanding what does this parameter do? Or maybe they can't even find it. So that could be maybe that there would be some edge cases where it's needed to have use cases exemplified. And that's also where you would have the technical content, and there would be some specific use cases to outline some different scenarios of how you would use X, Y, Z. And then this here is an example of how we have our technical documentation organized. So in the API reference is only the APIs, and here is more like use cases of, let's say, explaining the payment methods, and then going into use cases of, okay, there's this functionality and how would you use that? And then also allowing merchants to know that you can test it by having some sample cards. And then also understanding how is the consumer's user journey when they're in the checkout. So as a merchant, you would know, okay, you're supposed to do these different steps, and then how it looks in the checkout when you're testing it. Yeah, so for this method, we're doing, or for in our team, we're going with the approach of continuous delivery. And we're doing so because we have different environments where we're testing the content before we push it into production. So we have test environment, draft environment, and production, and we're doing so, let's say I'm doing a change, and before I want to push it into production, I'll let one of the developers make sure, okay, is this a good enough change? And we're doing deployments every 2 weeks, so we're doing it in sprints, and then we look over to see if our updates are making any good changes for the merchants. Yeah, wrapping up and looking into maybe like next steps in terms of this. With technical documentation, there's a lot of talks about the information architecture and how you want to have APIs displayed. Sometimes it can be hard for, if there's like a long scroll of a lot of information, how are you supposed to find it? And looking into always having this continuous loop of feedback with all the key stakeholders. And also something that Lucas talked about earlier, having early involvement of stakeholders to be in the whole life cycle of this API management. Yeah, and looking into the content hierarchy and how is the navigation. Are the users mostly going in to just straight search for something, or are they actually, they know what they're looking for, or how would they know a specific parameter is existing without maybe knowing the naming of it? Yeah, so looking into having a passive user or an active learner. Yep. And then just want to say thank you.
So thank you very much, Thanh, and also for making the time to come here and share your perspective. Do we have any questions from the audience or suggestions?
Thanks. So you mentioned that basically you get the notification when a PR is submitted about changes, and that's when you, it seemed that this is when you start working and investigating and like basically preparing for the documentation and the case, like use cases, or does the process actually start earlier, or like how much do you know about upcoming changes before a PR is submitted?
So I definitely know it beforehand. That's where I'm discussing with the product team. So for example, the product owner will let me know that there is planned these functionalities, and then I already write the content for that. But in terms of the API, that's, you know, coming on a continuous basis, that's really dependent on the developers. And then that's where I see the notifications of the pull request. Mm-hmm.
So there's another question.
In terms of writing the documentation, have you experienced Markdown instead of JSON to write the documentation?
Could you repeat the last
Have
part?
you experienced Markdown to write the documentation?
Yes, all the technical documentation that I showed on here is written in Markdown, and then
Okay.
the API is purely JSON.
Okay, cool.
Any other questions? There is one.
So just to follow up on that, because your developer portal, your documentation, as you mentioned, it has this JSON for the API, and then it uses your content comes from a different place. So is that like any specific software that you're using for your portal, or is this like a custom built solution, like a static page generator or something, where you bring these types of content together?
Yeah, excellent question. We're actually using Contentful as our CMS. And that's where we're having all the content structured into. It will like branch out as a tree. That's where we have all this information, and then and the API is only purely with the JSON.
Okay, so but what do you use to render the content that comes from Contentful? Because I think Contentful is just like a headless CMS, so it doesn't really render your website.
We're using a lot of different tools. We're having GraphQL. We're using Algolia as our search engine. Yeah, there are many kind of different components that are tying it in together to make all the content.
Okay, thanks.
There is another question.
So you are also the Swagger or that developer that write the API?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
The API specification is the developer that write it?
Yes, all the JSON in the raw file you saw, that was the developer, but I'm still in the doc JSON file on the other side. That's the one I'm updating. So the raw is what I get from the developers, but the doc JSON file is, let's say there are any amendments to any of the descriptions, because that will in the end be the user-facing one, which is shown on here.